This week is the OGS Conference at the Kalahari Resort in Sandusky, Ohio, and we thought as a special treat for our listeners, we're going to give you a double episode today of the Ohio Roots podcast. We're speaking with OGS Conference presenters Maureen Brady and Michael John Neill, and I hope you enjoy this double episode of the Ohio Roots podcast, and we'll see you in Kalahari. Welcome to Ohio Roots, the official podcast of the Ohio Genealogical Society. Join us as we embark on a captivating journey through Ohio's rich genealogy, history, and abundant resources. Hosted by me, OGS Executive Director Noel Poirier, this podcast brings you insightful conversations with a diverse array of guests, from OGS members, chapter leaders, and staff to renowned genealogists, historians, and influential figures within the genealogical community. Each episode delves into fascinating topics and captivating stories. So grab your headphones, hit that play button, and join us on this enthralling journey of Ohio's roots. Discover your roots and light up your genealogy. Join us for the Ohio Genealogical Society's annual conference, April 30th through May 3rd, 2025, at the beautiful Kalahari Resort in Sandusky, Ohio. Learn from top genealogy experts, explore groundbreaking research techniques, and connect with fellow family history enthusiasts. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned pro, this is the must-attend event for discovering your story. Visit ogs.org to register today. That's ogs.org. Let's light up your family history together. OGS, connecting families, past and present. Our guest on this episode of the OGS Ohio Roots podcast is Maureen Brady. Maureen is a former school librarian and computer educator with more than 30 years' experience with family history research. Maureen will be presenting at the 2025 OGS Conference this year, and I'm particularly interested in one of her programs that'll hit close to home for me. So I hope you enjoy our conversation today with Maureen Brady. Well, I'd like to welcome Maureen Brady to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. Maureen, thank you so much for being here today with me to talk about the 2025 OGS Conference and some of your presentations there. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great. If you've listened to the podcast, or if you haven't, that's okay. I won't take it personally, but we always start by asking our guests how they got started in genealogy and family history. Was it a particular story, family member? What led you to going down the route?
Well, I was somewhat interested when I was a teenager, and mostly on my dad's side. My mom's parents and brothers were the immigrants from Scotland in 1913, and I grew up in a two-flat in Chicago, and they lived in the other flat. So Scottish heritage was always part of my life, and I knew who my cousins and aunts and uncles and everybody were. But my dad's side were Chicago Irish, back at least 4 generations. And whenever I'd ask my dad a question, it was usually, well, I didn't really know my grandparents, and no, I don't really know anything about Ireland. And so I kind of gave up. But in the late 80s, mid 80s, actually, one of my mother's brothers passed away, and it was her last sibling. And I was standing there actually at the wake, greeting people. And the thought suddenly occurred to me that with this last uncle passing on, that the stories were dying.
Right.
I knew people, and I knew where they lived and all of that in Scotland, but I didn't know what their lives were like. I didn't know what they had done for a living. And once they were gone, the stories were gone. And so that got me into it. That really got me into it on a very regular basis. I've been going to a family history center, now family search centers, at least weekly for the last 40 years, ever since then.
So what part of Scotland were your family from?
They're from Aberdeenshire, the Northeast Muckle, as I call it.
Okay.
And go back at least to the mid-1600s there.
Wow. All right. I appreciate that because, I know I have ancestors who are from England mostly, and my family was very kind of quiet about their lives. It took me digging to actually find out who they were and what they did. And so I certainly resonate with your story. Although it's interesting. You mentioned you were at a funeral, and it always seems like to me those are great opportunities.
Yeah.
As horrible as that might be to say. They're great opportunities for talking to people about family. You're going to give, I believe it is 4 presentations at this year's conference, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And I won't lie to you, I have a very particular interest in one of them, which you might guess just from my name. But I'm really looking forward to all of them. One of the things you're talking about are kind of the British resources that folks can expect to find at Find My Past. And why is that a unique experience compared to any other place?
It's unique in that it is the strongest for British military records. And because we have the most British, both English, Welsh, and Scottish records in terms of civil registration really don't start into the mid-19th century. Mm-hmm. And to get back further, you need church records, which in some cases are there but don't have much information. But the military is one of the areas where you're going to be able to dig into real deep, specific types of information about the men who served in the military. And for many of the people, the workers, the tradesmen, the laborers, that was one of their steps up in society.
Right.
So Find My Past has the strongest collection of British military records of all the sites, and that includes Ancestry and Family Search. And they also have now the English parish records, which have been very, very difficult to get hold of, indexed well.
Wow.
And so they are doing a very good job of that. And so that's why that's my go-to for British research, especially outside of Scotland. Because a lot of families from Scotland went down to England to work the coal mines or whatever, or English moved up to Scotland, vice versa. So when I hit one of those kinds of families, I'll immediately go to Find My Past.
Okay. And that's good. It's, what I find fascinating generally about online research, and you mentioned you're going to family search centers still today physically, because that's where really the goodies are. But there's still a lot more cuts coming up online, isn't there? That's just being made available every day.
It is difficult to keep up with all of the additions every week.
Right.
When I give my presentations, I always point out that this is the way it was yesterday when I double checked, or last week when I double checked. And it's something that even if you use a particular site and you think you've looked at everything, go back in a month and see what else has been added.
Yeah. I like your focus on your British Isles ancestry, because you've got another program you're doing on first frontiersmen, on the Scotch Irish in general.
Yes.
And of course, as you know, in Ohio here, we were and are, and well, in a way, we're still a frontier, but we were definitely the frontier in the 18th and 17th centuries. And so I know that's a big movement of Scots Irish into this area as well. So what else are people going to learn from that?
Well, we talk about how they became Scots Irish, because that is a term that literally only exists in the United States.
Right.
And then their movement from Pennsylvania down through the Great Valley of Virginia and so forth, and the specific records that you can find in Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and then across the Ohio into the Ohio Valley. I talk about that movement and the reasons for it, and why that was different than the Atlantic border of the colonies, the movement there, and the difference in the peoples. Bring up some books that I think are excellent background books.
Okay. It's interesting you say that. When I was in Ireland several years ago, we went to a museum called the Ulster American Folk Park. And the Ulster American Folk Park is a museum dedicated to the migration of the Irish to America. And so you literally step onto a ship in England at the museum, and then when you step off the ship, you're in Baltimore. And then they have a wonderful Virginia farm site there, Scots Irish Virginia farm site, that when you stand back, because the Sparran Mountains are in the background, and when you stand back and look at it, you swear you're in the Shenandoah Valley. I mean, it's just so perfectly done. And I know if you've ever been to the Frontier Culture Museum in Virginia, in Stanton, Virginia, they have a similar setup, but reversed. So it's interesting to see their perspective on their own migration to America and how important they think it is.
Yes, there's even a couple of statues in various parts of Ireland that commemorate the movement of the Ulster Scots across to become Scots Irish.
Yeah, it's just a fascinating story, and they're fascinating too because of their fascinating personalities
Yes.
that they brought with them over the mountains. So that's always there are always some great stories about that. You've got a good one. I like the way your What's in a Name program. Talk to me a little bit about that. I'm not going to try to spell them out because they'll just confuse people.
Well,
We'll have to look at the book.
Middle English forms of the words, the spelling
Right.
of the words. Since I've been at a family search center, and I have been working in a family search center for those 40 years as well, I have met a lot of patrons over the years, and a good portion of them insist that their name has always been spelled that way. It never changed. Even 2 generations ago, it was spelled that way, and so forth and so on. And it came to me that because we have people that, especially newcomers, but even sometimes the mid-level researchers, they concentrate too much on that spelling.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that they're not becoming aware of a choice piece of information just because the spelling is different. So I put this together to give them give them the background of how our names were formed, at least primarily, and then give them some ideas of how those names could have been spelled in the past and resources that can help them figure out, well, could this be the same name or not? And so on. And some research strategies when names are spelled differently as you go back in time and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know my own surname, which is spelled with a lot of vowels, comes up in various ways, and that kind of leads me into our next conversation, I think. But what's your Quebecois connection?
My Quebecois connection? I'm the family genealogist, and as such, whenever someone has been married into our family, it seems like, well, gee, Aunt Maureen, can't you? And then so I start working on that branch. And one of my nieces married a gentleman from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan whose paternal line is pure Quebecois, who moved to the Upper Peninsula in the 1880s and have the very early Quebec roots in New France. They go back to about 1620 in the Montreal area. And so getting into his research meant I had to get into the Quebecois records and research and history and all of that. And recently, I've been working for a client who is on the English side of that settlement, or rather the Scottish side of that settlement, along the Ottawa River. And so now I'm learning how they interacted with those French and what kinds of records they created or were not created separately, but were actually in the French Catholic records and so on. So,
in full disclosure, being Quebecois back to 1640 myself, Acadian Quebecois. They went to Quebec from Acadia. My great grandfather immigrated from Canada, from Quebec to Fall River, Massachusetts, to work in the silk mills there. So I kind of know where you're going to go with this, but I'm going to ask anyway. Besides the language, which is an obvious challenge, what are the other barriers to doing Quebecois research?
Well, I've really not found a lot.
Okay.
However, when you get into the 17th century, you really have to start learning about and using notarial records.
Right.
Notarial records are the way they recorded any kind of an official exchange contract, marriage contract, whatever. And being A, French, and B, in French legalese terms, it becomes extremely difficult. And it was also a problem because you had to know the name of the notary to find the record, because it was all kept by that notary's name. Well, if you're in Montreal, how many notaries are there to choose from? So it was always very, very difficult to really get into those 17th century records. But now, Family Search has now loaded those notarial records into the full search text experiment. And I'm now starting to get into them by searching the family surname.
Wow.
And I'm going to be spending a lot of time in that because that's half a family. But it's making it much easier now than it used to be. Still have to deal with the language and the legalese, but at least you can find it now.
Right. You can at least find the name of the person you're after.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel every time somebody asks me when they ask me my name and how to say it and those types of things, and they ask me if I'm French, I always say, no, I'm Quebecois. I take that very seriously, those roots, much more than France. You've obviously been doing genealogy for a very long time. You work at family search centers and help people. When someone walks in the door there and they're just kind of getting started on doing family research, and the fact that they've shown up at your door is actually a good start to begin with.
Right.
But from that point, what is the best bit of advice you give someone who's just getting started on that family research? What should they do right out of the gate?
Well, my first questions always rotate around what do you know, and who can you go ask? I've had patrons come in who literally had never talked to their grandparents, for instance, and both grandparents were still living and of good mind and so on. And have you gone and looked to see if anybody has a marriage record, a baptismal record? Here's your homework, because this is what you need to know to really get going. And even when they come in with something, they've never looked at it.
Right.
It's just a piece of paper to them. So I always start with the beginning steps is what do you know and who can you talk to?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's great. It's interesting because I ask that question of almost everybody I interview, and almost everybody has a very similar response, not surprisingly. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised. But one of the things that always comes back to is you've got living people around you need to be talking to, and so make sure you have a list of those people you can talk to. It kind of gets back to your story about your father, your uncles.
I have
stories.
I have a funny story about that from my days at the center. We had a mother and daughter come in one night, and I was asking him those questions, and I gave him a pedigree chart. Let's start filling it in, and came to the mother's parents' names, and the mother didn't know her own grandparents. And then she said, "This is the funny part. Well, should I call my mother and ask her? And she's in Ireland, she'll know." And her daughter said, "You didn't even call grandma yet?" And we're just standing there in the center kind of chuckling to ourselves. And so that's what her mother did, pull the phone out. It was back in the day, beginning day of cell phones, and she just pulled it out and called mom over in Ireland.
Oh, that's funny. It's just and that's why I like to ask, what do you do with someone who's just getting started? Because sometimes they don't even know to do that, one basic thing. How many OGS conferences have you attended in the past?
Well, this is my second year in a row speaking, but I've been to several in the past, especially, and I hate to be critical here, and I don't mean it in a critical way, but especially before they started going to water park hotels.
Right. Okay.
When it was still relatively reasonably priced hotel rooms, shall we say. I've been to a couple up and down the state. I'm a life member of OGS.
Well, thank you.
And have been for at least 30 years. And so I have gone until it became, why do I want to spend that much money to go? And it's been a matter of economics, especially since I retired in 1990 and things have been getting a little tough. But I enjoy them. They've always been a great place to go and learn. And I've always told other people that are doing Ohio research, you need to go to the OGS conference or the library in Belleville.
Well, thank you for that plug as well. I appreciate it. Well, Maureen Brady, I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the conference this year. I'm definitely going to try to get into your Quebecois class because I definitely need some work on that on my own side of it. So I appreciate you spending some time with me today for the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. Thank you, Maureen. Well, my Quebecois ancestors would be very happy to know that there are folks like Maureen Brady out there helping people navigate the very complicated records of Quebec for them. I know that was always a challenge for me when I did my own family history research. I want to thank Maureen for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing her presentations at the 2025 OGS Conference. You can learn more about Maureen's work and her speaking schedule at her website, chitownroots.com. That's chitownroots.com. You can find all of our podcast episodes online at www.ogs.com/podcasts. And thank you for listening to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast. If you enjoy listening to the Ohio Roots podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could go to whatever platform it is that you listen and give us a good review. Reviews help us get more listeners and reach more people with Ohio Roots and what we're trying to do with the Ohio Genealogical Society. So please leave us a nice review, and thanks for listening. Our guest on this episode of the OGS Ohio Roots podcast is genealogist and mathematician Michael John Neill. You likely know him better, though, as the author of the Genealogy Tip of the Day. Michael is presenting at the 2025 OGS Conference this year, and we wanted to find out what he has in store for us there and learn a little more about his own genealogical story. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Michael John Neill. Well, I'd like to welcome Michael John Neill to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast today. Michael, thank you so much for being here with me. I appreciate it.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
We'll chat about a bunch of different things today, but I want to get started with something that I ask all of our guests when they come on the podcast, because one of the things I find fascinating about genealogy are the backgrounds of everybody involved and kind of the diversity of that. And so how is it that Michael John Neill got involved in doing family history? What was the impetus for that?
I guess umpteen years ago when I was, 11, 12, my brother had to do one of those 4-generation trees that you have to do. And for some reason, I was just a little more interested than he was, apparently. And it just kind of ballooned from there. You know, my grandparents, 3 of them were alive at the time. I could ask them questions, and it just kind of ballooned from there.
Was there a particular, I mean, you talk about your brother having to do the 4-generation tree. Was there a particular family member who helped encourage you along as well?
I guess no one really discouraged it, I guess. Yeah. You know, my grandparents were somewhat interested, but not excessively so, you know. And nobody discouraged me. And I always knew my heritage on my mother's side. They were immigrants, my great-great-grandparents. Yeah. And my grandparents knew where their grandparents came from. They knew the names of the villages. They'd been there to see it. Wow. All right. They weren't genealogists per se, but they were very interested in their history. So that helped.
Were you able to kind of immediately discover some interesting tidbits about your family?
I think so. In part, I lived 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the county courthouse where a lot of my people had lived since the 1850s. So I had access to a lot of that information, and it was a rural area. They let you go back in the courthouse and look things up, and we just made a lot of discoveries that way.
And you were digging that stuff up when you were 11? In the courthouse?
Well, it was a little bit older when I started making those trips to the courthouse. I was probably 13, 12 when I made my first trip. And then once I got my driver's license and there weren't chores to do, I would, in the summertime, I'd drive into because they had air conditioning in the courthouse. We didn't have air conditioning at home.
So a good way to spend the day. I would go in there
in the summertime. Yeah, it was just perfect.
That's pretty nice. Now, I know you've been at OGS's conference several times in the past, and I know I always look forward to seeing you're always in the exhibition room as well. Typically, it's when I usually see you there, because I don't get a chance to go to too many of the actual workshops, unfortunately. But I know you're giving 4 programs at this year's conference, correct?
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
And I found, one of the ones that jumped out at me, because my academic background's in history, and I think part of me particularly pursued that in an effort to avoid mathematics at all costs. And so I'm curious, you've got one on here on math skills for genealogists, and I'm curious, kind of what's the root of that? Where'd that come from?
Well, in my other life, I was a community college math instructor for 30 years, so it kind of came from that. And one of the examples we talk about how states are settled up when there's no will, no descendants, but a lot of extended family. And I always thought that was kind of fun to see how those partitions were figured out and whatnot. And the math isn't that complicated, but people seem to think it is. And understanding the numbers of that can help you to determine relationships. And that's part of why you need to have a broad overview of it. And even in DNA analysis, it's not math per se, but some of those sorting skills, critical thinking skills really apply when you're looking at your DNA results as well, too.
Yeah. I've spoken to some DNA folks, and they always talk in terms of decimal points, and so they lose me a little bit at that point, I think. So I'm gone. I'm out of the conversation.
It can get a little tedious, but the categorizing, there's some set theory. We're not going to talk about that in the presentation. We're going to take it low key, but there's some general concepts that if a person kind of thinks about, that can help you with some of these, some of the analysis of things a little bit.
Well, that'll be very helpful for a lot of people. I know it would be helpful for me. I'm just, again, I've avoided math like the plague somehow through 54 years of my life.
People sometimes do that.
Yeah. One of the other presentations you're giving deals with, kind of locating your female ancestors, and what are the particular challenges that you are hoping to kind of help people with in that course?
I would say with females, one problem, especially if they're in areas where women change their name when they get married, that's one issue. But probably the bigger issues with females are women's legal rights have changed over time.
Right.
If you're not aware of that, you should learn more about that before you do any more genealogy, to be perfectly frank with you. But because of that, they're not as often to be listed in records. There's not as much detail in records about them. And so we have to understand the law a little bit. We don't have to become lawyers. We got to have a broad understanding of that we can interpret things. And then so we know where to look and we know how to analyze what we do find about those females.
Yeah. It's fascinating. We have a collection at the OGS archive called the Wissamore Photograph Collection, and Wissamore was a photographer who went to Richland County, Ohio, in 1875, and offered to take photographs of everybody who was there. And we have this collection. I think it's over 800 photographs, and all the women are listed as Mrs. Somebody. So I found one reference to a woman who had her own actual name in there, and most of them are Mrs. Somebody, which is a challenge.
It is. I was looking at one today for the tip of the day, and she's not even listed as Mrs. She's listed as widow and then the last name, not even her husband's first name. So there's just, I reminded people sometimes we take, look for, especially in newspapers and those kind of records, you have to look for them under their husband's name because they're, like you say, Mrs. John Smith.
Right.
She was just widow Goldenstein. Not even his first name. Her kids are all named.
Right.
But she's just widow in her last name. So
that's
a problem too.
The home I live in New Philadelphia, Ohio, was once owned by a woman by the name of Florence Marsh. And Florence was kind of ahead of her time. She was the leader of the suffragist movement here in Tuscarawas County in the early 20th century. And she was one of the first women to be put on a jury here in Tuscarawas County. And it was a rape case. And the judge asked her if she wanted to be excused. And she said, no. She said, I have every right to be on this jury and I will be here. So, but luckily I know her name. So thank goodness for that. So what are we preserving that can't be preserved? Sorry, it's another one of your programs.
The concepts in that one is like memories,
right?
One thing we're going to talk about that's really important because those things that are in somebody's mind, are one of the first things to go. But then some of the larger things like, photographs and paper you can maybe preserve, but sometimes houses, businesses, farms, larger things you can't. And so what you know about, that's one of the things we're going to talk about. The things that you know about that you should preserve, try to find some of that history. But a chunk of it's going to be about memories. It's also going to be some things that maybe you can't preserve. Some smaller physical things that might deteriorate. Things might not last as long as you would like. We're going to talk about some ways to preserve that. Usually digital imaging is one really good way to do that, because do you have to preserve everything? We're going to address that just a little bit. Because one of the things I try to suggest to people is if you have a lot of stuff, and some people that if you don't have many family items, it's hard to understand this, but there's a few of us that have the other end of the spectrum where we have storage totes and storage units filled with stuff, and you can't keep everything. So what do you downsize? And maybe there's even some things you don't even need to preserve or keep, because the more you keep, the more someone else has to go through later.
Right.
And my take on that is, if you inherit something from or your kids get all this stuff and there's too much of it, you don't want them to give in to the temptation of just trashing it all and saying, Mom kept all this stuff. I'm never going to get through all of it. I'm just done with it. You don't want that to happen. And so curating what you've got is an important thing and a good part of this, in addition to preserving things that are ephemeral in nature that we have to think about ways that we can preserve those long term.
Yeah, it reminds me, of what we do with the OGS archive and library when we work with a potential donor about what to donate. And there are folks who are doing exactly what you said. They're essentially cleaning out their parents' house, and they were quote into genealogy, and so they'll bring in boxes and boxes of things. And we always make the argument with our potential donors that we'd like to see the collection, or at least have some list of the collection first, so that we can make a determination of what in that collection is worth preserving, as you said, as opposed to binders full of printouts from Find a Grave, or something like that. We want to make sure we're preserving correctly, and the resources involved in preservation, whether it's personal or in an archive setting, aren't cheap.
Right, and sometimes I'll say to people, you don't need, what those 1880 census printouts that you made years ago. If you want to keep them, that's fine. But if you're thinking of donating your collection to somebody, they're going to want to try to preserve what is unique.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, an 1850 census printout is not.
Yeah.
But you're right. People just think they can just dump it at a library or an archives, and that's not always practical for them. And the other thing is they sometimes need money to maintain these things. And if you've got a huge collection of materials, and you might also want to think about some financial compensation as a part of that donation to help maintain that, because they need funds to maintain. They need space and all that goes along with that.
We regularly go through a process where we try to share with folks, whether it's on our website or webinars or social media, the process that we go through for preserving a collection, how it comes to us, usually in a banker's box, and how it has to be converted from that state to archival folders, archival boxes, all the paper clips and staples removed. And it's an incredibly time-consuming process. So I appreciate you kind of shouting out there for donations as well, because the money helps us do all that kind of work. I'm also reminded, you're part about preserving what can't be preserved. Is my daughter for many years was the manager of a large thrift store here in Ohio, and families would dump off boxes of things that they're cleaning out of the house, and in there would be a photo album, an old photo album with photographs going back generations, that they just simply didn't care to look through. And I know she would always bring those things to me, and we'd try to find a home. But it's a challenge. I mean, I think knowing what you can preserve and how to preserve it is a great program. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. And because what sometimes happens is, if it depends on the situation, but people might have a very short amount of time to clean out a house or whatever, and they might not have the inclination to go through everything, and it's just usually gets dumped is what happens in those cases.
Yeah, and I know us as genealogists and family historians are not the kind of people who typically do that. We become the repositories of all that. But yeah, I think most people are probably out there trying to do the best they can. One of your courses looks like a very technical one. So it's about using the full text search on Family Search, and it sounds very it's kind of self-described in the title, but talk to me a little bit about that program.
In that session, we're going to look at ways you can try to effectively search, because the full text search at Family Search, at least as of the time we're having this conversation, it includes a lot of local county court land and probate records, in addition to there's other things too, but that's the bulk of what's in there. We're going to look at some creative ways to search that. We're going to talk about some of the limitations of that. It's great. It gives us access to a lot of materials to search in a way that we could never search before. If when I started this umpteen years ago, you had said to me, someday there will be a way to search for a certain last name in all those deed books, like the books behind me, and all those deed books you see in that courthouse, one last name, I would have said, you are full of something. But that's essentially what we can do. And it's a wonderful opportunity, but like any opportunity or any tool, we need to know what the limitations of it are in order for us to effectively use it and get the most out of it. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to see a few real quick neat things that I discovered, because I think that's motivational for people to see, here's some really cool stuff. But then we're going to look at, people don't like me when I talk about the negatives, but you've got to understand the negatives of things in order for you to make good use of what's there. Because there's a lot of nice things you can discover using that full text search, but it's not going to solve every problem.
It's interesting. We always talk about databases, information technology. We talk about databases as garbage in, garbage out. So because there's always a human error possibly involved in the process. And I think that's probably true with family search as well. But then you throw in the next level of AI reading things, and you get a whole other level of challenges, don't you think?
Right, because the transcriptions are great, and it's great to have those, but the wonky ways it interprets things sometimes can be a problem, and sometimes people will get irritated with the way it transcribes things, and the standard answer to that is, well, then you go back to that courthouse and look at every book yourself, page by page. That's my shut you up answer. I mean, there's just no other way.
Right.
That's what it is. It's got limitations, and that's fine. If you don't want to use it, then you're back to the old way, which you're going to find some things, but not as many things as you can find using their full text search.
It's funny. I teach a course on researching house histories using online sources, and I will occasionally get the question about someone's house somewhere, and I'll say, you're going to have to get in your car and drive somewhere. That's you will not be able to find that out with these resources. So, and I think the internet has spoiled us in a way, in thinking that everything we could possibly want and have is going to be right in front of us and at our fingertips.
No, I think you're right. I get that when I suggest to people, well, if you can't find them in a census and you know about where they lived, you can go page by page and do a manual search.
Yeah.
And they look at me like I have asked them to give me both their kidneys and liver. Like it's what we used. It's what you have to do sometimes. That's what we used to do, but it can still be done.
And those of us who went into courthouses when we were 11, which I can throw myself and lump that in there, and had to work with microfilm machines where you're spinning the microfilm around for an hour, and you get that wonderful wonky eye rotation in your eyes after you stop because you've been spinning it so far. No one will ever understand the joy of that unless they've done it.
No,
Michael,
they won't.
Michael, when you were 11 years old, what bit of advice do you wish a seasoned genealogist would have given you getting started in genealogy?
Oh boy, I think at the time, maybe two things. Keeping track. I learned early on, but not super early. Keeping track of where you found things, and really making certain you've gone and talked to all your different family members. Because I focused on really close ones, like my grandparents, and I didn't think about their first cousins. Using that probably as the example, because they were. Their first cousins, obviously, and second cousins, in some cases, would have known just as much or more than they did. I really just focused on my immediate family when I was asking those questions. Yeah. And that's a good starting point, but I wish I'd talked to some of those more extended family members as well at the time, because now they're not here anymore.
I'm trying to figure out why I ask that question anymore in these interviews, because almost everybody has said the same thing. Talk to the living. Talk to as many of the living as you can talk to.
Well, the thing is, I think that it doesn't hurt for people to hear that. I think it also helps that they hear that people that have done this forever or whatever, or supposedly know what they're talking about, have some of the same frustrations.
Exactly.
They kind of makes us a little more relatable, I guess, if you will.
And I think it's important, because I think family history is so important for us to preserve. And Michael, thank you for all that you do for genealogy, and I appreciate you coming on the OGS Ohio Roots podcast today to chat with me. Looking forward to seeing you at conference. Michael John Neill, thanks so much for being here. Ready to light up your genealogy? Mark your calendars for the Ohio Genealogical Society's annual conference happening April 30th to May 3rd, 2025 at Kalahari Resorts in Sandusky, Ohio. Immerse yourself in inspiring workshops, expert-led sessions, and exciting discoveries that will help you uncover your family's history. Plus, enjoy the perfect blend of learning and relaxation at one of Ohio's favorite destinations. Don't miss out. Visit ogs.org to learn more and to register. That's ogs.org. Come, connect, learn, and ignite your family story. Well, thank you to Michael for taking the time to speak with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope that you did as well. I'm sure that the programs he'll be presenting at 2025's OGS Conference are going to be excellent as always. You can find out more about Michael John Neill and the Genealogy Tip of the Day online at rootdig.genealogytipoftheday.com. You can find all of our podcast episodes online at www.ogs.com/podcasts. Thank you for listening to the OGS Ohio Roots podcast.
The Ohio Roots podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Genealogical Society, the premier gateway for discovering your Ohio family history. Hosted by OGS Executive Director Neill and edited by Luke Poyer. Theme song is Beautiful Ohio, recorded by Bob Stanley and his orchestra in 1944. To learn more about joining the Ohio Genealogical Society, visit www.ogs.org.